The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of the downtown courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Dr. Maya Richardson's heels clicked rhythmically as she hurried through the security checkpoint, her mind still processing the quantum mechanics formulas she'd been reviewing for next week's international conference in Geneva. 7 minutes, she whispered to herself, checking her elegant watch, a graduation gift from her late grandmother. 7 minutes until her scheduled court appearance for what should have been a simple parking matter. In 15 years of driving, she'd never received so much as a warning, but today of all days, fate had other plans. The security guard, an elderly gentleman with kind eyes, noticed her anxious glance at the directory board. "Courtroom 4B, down the hall to your right, Mom," he offered with a gentle smile. Dr. Richardson thanked him with a grateful nod, clutching her leather briefcase closer. Inside was the draft of her groundbreaking research paper that had consumed her life for the past 3 years. As she approached courtroom 4B, the sound of a gavel pierced through the heavy wooden doors. Judge William Barrett's reputation preceded him. Colleagues at the university had warned her about his strict adherence to scheduling and no-nonsense approach. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed down her charcoal gray suit and entered the courtroom. The scene before her was a study in controlled chaos. Legal aides scurried between benches with stacks of papers, while attorneys huddled in corners, whispering strategies to their clients. Judge Barrett sat elevated behind his massive oak bench, his silver hair and black robes creating an imposing figure against the wood-paneled walls. Case number 47,293. The court clerk announced, her voice carrying across the room. "Richardson, Maya." Dr. Richardson stepped forward, her posture straight and professional despite the early morning rush. She'd faced more daunting situations, defending her doctoral thesis, presenting at CERN, and speaking before Nobel laureates. Yet something about Judge Barrett's unwavering stare made her pause. He barely looked up from the papers before him, his wire-rimmed glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. "Ms. Richardson, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone outside the Science Center on Tuesday, March 15th. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and measured, "if I may explain the circumstances." The question, "Ms. Richardson," is straightforward. How do you plead? Judge Barrett's tone carried years of authority, cut with a hint of impatience. The quantum physicist in her wanted to explain the principle of uncertainty, how context and observation could change the very nature of reality. The parking spot in question had been marked with conflicting signs, one indicating reserved parking and another suggesting public use during specific hours. But looking at Judge Barrett's stern expression, she realized this wasn't the time for scientific analogies. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she stated firmly, reaching into her briefcase for the photographs she'd taken of the contradictory signage. As she did so, a paper slipped out, the letter announcing her Guggenheim Fellowship, complete with the Foundation's golden seal. It floated to the floor, landing face down beneath the podium, unseen by the court. Judge Barrett's gavel rapped sharply against the sound block. "Ms. Richardson, this court's time is valuable. The signage regulations are quite clear to those who take the time to read them properly." The morning sun had shifted now, casting different shadows across the courtroom, and Dr. Richardson felt the weight of assumptions settling around her like a heavy cloak. Little did anyone know that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. The courtroom's air conditioning hummed softly as Dr. Richardson carefully removed the photographs from her briefcase. Her hands were steady, the same hands that had calibrated million-dollar laboratory equipment and written equations that challenged the fundamentals of quantum physics. The images clearly showed the conflicting parking signs, their timestamps authenticated by the university's security system. "Your Honor, if you'll examine these photographs," she began, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used during guest lectures at MIT and Stanford. Judge Barrett raised his hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Ms. Richardson, this court sees dozens of parking violations every morning. Each person believes their case is special. He peered over his glasses, his expression suggesting he'd heard every excuse imaginable. The fine is $150. Dr. Richardson felt her pulse quicken, not from anger, but from a familiar feeling of being dismissed before having the chance to present her evidence. She thought of her students, how she always encouraged them to stand up for truth with grace and persistence. Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the signage. If you'll allow me 30 seconds to demonstrate. Make that $200, Judge Barrett interrupted, his tone sharpening. This court's decision is final unless you wish to file a formal appeal, which will require a filing fee of $75 and a court date approximately 6 weeks from now. The court clerk, Mrs. Chen, glanced up from her computer with concern. In 15 years of service, she'd developed an instinct for unusual cases, and something about this one felt different. She watched as Dr. Richardson maintained her composure, standing tall in her perfectly pressed suit. I understand, Your Honor, Dr. Richardson replied, reaching for her wallet. As she did so, a small notebook fell from her briefcase, opening to reveal complex mathematical formulas and a sticky note with Geneva Conference Keynote scribbled in neat handwriting. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened slightly as she caught glimpse of the equations. Her son, a physics major, had similar notebooks filled with incomprehensible symbols and numbers. But before she could process this detail, the courtroom doors burst open. A rush of cool air swept through the room as Professor James Chen, no relation to the clerk, hurried in, clutching the latest issue of International Science Review. His bow tie was slightly askew, and his excitement was palpable. He had been searching for Dr. Richardson all morning, unaware that a simple parking ticket had diverted her from their scheduled meeting about the upcoming Geneva conference. Judge Barrett's gavel struck his sound block sharply. Sir, this is a court in session. You cannot simply. But Professor Chen was already halfway to the podium, his face beaming with the kind of joy reserved for momentous occasions. The magazine in his hands bore Dr. Richardson's image on its cover, standing proudly in her laboratory, the prestigious Guggenheim medallion gleaming around her neck. The courtroom fell into a curious silence. Judge Barrett's stern expression flickered for just a moment as his eyes moved between the magazine cover and the woman standing before him. The narrative he had constructed in his mind about this case began to unravel thread by thread. Dr. Richardson remained still, her hand still holding her wallet, caught in this surreal moment where two worlds, the legal and the academic, collided in an unexpected dance. The morning sun continued its journey across the courtroom floor, illuminating dust particles that swirled in the air like tiny stars, waiting for the next moment to unfold. Professor Chen's excitement filled the courtroom like electricity in the air before a storm. Dr. Richardson, he exclaimed, either oblivious to or unconcerned with court protocol. Your quantum tunneling paper, it's revolutionary. The International Committee has named it Research of the Year. The magazine he held aloft caught the morning light, its glossy cover reflecting Dr. Richardson's professional headshot. She stood in her laboratory, sophisticated equipment gleaming behind her, the gold Guggenheim medallion prominent against her lab coat. The headline read, Quantum Breakthrough. Dr. Maya Richardson reshapes our understanding of reality. Judge Barrett's hand, which had been raised to reprimand the interruption, slowly lowered. His eyes moved from the magazine to Dr. Richardson, then back again, like a pendulum seeking equilibrium. The stern lines around his mouth softened almost imperceptibly. Your Honor, Mrs. Chen, the court clerk, spoke up unexpectedly. I believe there may be some relevant additional context for this case. She pulled up a browser window on her computer, typing quickly. Dr. Richardson is listed as the keynote speaker at next week's International Physics Summit in Geneva. She's also scheduled to receive the Presidential Medal of Science next month. The courtroom gallery, typically drowsy during morning traffic court, had come alive with whispers. A law student in the back row was frantically Googling on his phone, his eyes widening as he read. Professor Chen, still buzzing with excitement, approached the bench. Judge Barrett, Dr. Richardson's work on quantum tunneling could revolutionize everything from medical imaging to clean energy. She's been nominated for. Professor, Dr. Richardson interjected gently. The parking violation is still a matter that needs to be addressed. Her voice carried the same patience she used when explaining complex theories to first-year students. Judge Barrett removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly with his handkerchief, a gesture that gave him a moment to gather his thoughts. When he replaced them, his perspective had shifted, like a camera bringing a blurry image into sharp focus. Dr. Richardson, he began, his tone markedly different. Perhaps you could explain the circumstances of the parking incident in detail. He glanced at the photographs still clutched in her hand, the ones he had dismissed moments ago. She stepped forward, presenting the images with the same precision she used when presenting research data. As you can see, Your Honor, the signage presents contradictory information. The upper sign indicates reserved parking, while the lower sign, installed last month, suggests public access during specific hours. The judge studied the photographs intently. The morning sun had risen higher now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the courtroom in a warm glow. The earlier tension had transformed into something else, a shared moment of understanding and recalibration. A young girl in the gallery, there with her mother for a different case, watched the scene with wide-eyed fascination. She pulled out her notebook, writing Dr. Maya Richardson in careful letters, adding a small star beside the name. Given the evidence, Judge Barrett announced, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and humility, this case clearly requires a more thorough review. He paused, looking directly at Dr. Richardson for the first time since she'd entered his courtroom. And perhaps, Doctor, if your schedule permits, our local high school would benefit from a guest lecture on your work. Science education, it is, after all, vital to our community's future. In his chambers during the morning recess, Judge Barrett sat at his mahogany desk, the International Science Review open before him. His coffee, usually finished by this hour, remained untouched and cooling. The article about Dr. Richardson's achievements filled several pages, complete with photographs of her speaking at prestigious institutions worldwide. He clicked through her university profile on his computer, each new detail adding weight to his contemplation. National Science Foundation grants, 3 published books, guest lecturer at Oxford, and most recently, the coveted Guggenheim Fellowship. But it was the section about her community work that made him pause longest. A free physics program she'd started for underprivileged high school students, with an impressive 85% of participants going on to college with scholarships. Your Honor. Mrs. Chen knocked gently on his door. The afternoon docket begins in 20 minutes. She hesitated, then added, and Dr. Richardson's parking spot photos. I had security pulled the street camera footage. She was right about the conflicting signs. Judge Barrett nodded, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his desk. In 20 years on the bench, he'd prided himself on being fair and efficient. Efficient, he murmured, remembering how quickly he'd dismissed her evidence. The word had a different taste now. His eyes drifted to the family photo on his desk, his daughter's graduation from law school last year. He beamed with pride when she challenged his senior partner's assumption during her first week at the firm. Yet this morning, he'd done exactly what he taught her to fight against. The courthouse walls had witnessed countless moments of justice and injustice. Today, they'd witnessed something else. A mirror held up to show the subtle ways assumptions could cloud judgment, even for those tasked with being impartial. His computer pinged with an email notification. The high school principal had already responded enthusiastically to the possibility of Dr. Richardson giving a guest lecture. Our students, especially our young girls interested in STEM, would be incredibly inspired, the principal wrote. Standing up, Judge Barrett walked to his window overlooking the city. The university's science building was visible in the distance, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the classical courthouse. 2 worlds, he thought, that should complement rather than conflict with each other. He reached for his judicial robe, its weight familiar on his shoulders. But today, it felt different. a reminder of responsibility rather than just authority. The morning's events played in his mind like a carefully constructed legal argument, each piece of evidence pointing to a clear verdict. He needed to do better. Mrs. Chen appeared again at his door. "Judge, I've taken the liberty of researching similar cases with conflicting signage. There's precedent for dismissal, especially given the recent changes in parking regulations." He smiled slightly, appreciating her thoroughness. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Please prepare the dismissal forms." He paused, then added, "And could you reach out to the administrative office about a review of all street signage in the University District? It seems we might have a systemic issue to address." As he prepared to return to the courtroom, Judge Barrett straightened his bow tie in the mirror. The face that looked back at him was the same, yet somehow changed. Reminded that true justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but the wisdom to see beyond immediate assumptions to the fuller picture of human experience. The morning's events in courtroom 4B rippled through the city like waves in a pond. By afternoon, local news websites had picked up the story, not as a tale of conflict, but as an inspiring moment of transformation. From parking ticket to partnership, how a courtroom encounter is changing our city, read the headline in the Evening Standard. In her university office, Dr. Richardson sat surrounded by stacks of congratulatory emails, her quantum physics formulas temporarily forgotten on the whiteboard behind her. A group of her students had gathered outside, eager to hear firsthand about the morning's events. But it was one particular email that held her attention, a message from a young girl who had been in the courtroom with her mother. "Dear Dr. Richardson," the email read, "I saw you in court today. I didn't understand all the science stuff, but I understood how you stayed strong and polite. I want to be a scientist too. Could you tell me where to start?" A smile touched Dr. Richardson's lips as she began typing her reply, inviting the girl to visit her laboratory. Her phone buzzed with another notification, the local science museum requesting her participation in their upcoming Women in Science exhibition. Across town, Judge Barrett's clerk, Mrs. Chen, was fielding calls from other district courts interested in implementing similar community outreach programs. The judge's decision to review parking regulations around educational institutions had sparked a larger conversation about accessibility and community engagement. In the courthouse cafeteria, legal interns huddled around their phones, watching Dr. Richardson's TED talk about making science accessible to underprivileged communities. "She's not just brilliant," one intern remarked, "she's changing lives." The university president seized the moment, announcing a new initiative, Bridges of Understanding, a series of public lectures where experts from various fields would share their knowledge with the community. Judge Barrett was invited to give the first lecture on the intersection of law and social progress. Local coffee shops buzzed with discussions about the morning's events. A barista who had witnessed the courtroom scene posted about it on social media. "Saw something amazing today. Two people from different worlds found common ground. Maybe that's what progress looks like." Dr. Richardson's afternoon physics class was packed, with students from other departments sitting in the aisles. They weren't all there for the quantum mechanics. They wanted to see the professor who had handled a challenging situation with such grace and dignity. As evening approached, Dr. Richardson found a surprising delivery on her desk, a potted plant with a note from the courthouse staff. "Thank you for teaching us all something today." Next to it sat a letter from the city's education board, requesting her help in developing a STEM mentorship program for local schools. The setting sun cast long shadows through her laboratory windows as she prepared for her next class. On her computer screen, a news article featured side-by-side photos, one of her receiving the Guggenheim Fellowship, another of Judge Barrett speaking at a community event. The caption read, "When Wisdom Meets Understanding, a Story of Growth." Her phone lit up with a message from her mother. "Baby, you didn't just win an argument today. You opened doors." Dr. Richardson looked at the quantum equations on her whiteboard, thinking how similar they were to human interactions. Complex, interconnected, and full of unexpected possibilities. The grand lecture hall of the City Bar Association buzzed with anticipation. Legal professionals, students, and community members filled every seat, while others stood along the walls. At the podium, Judge Barrett adjusted his microphone, glancing at the distinguished guest he was about to introduce. Dr. Richardson sat in the front row, her presentation on perspectives in science and society ready on her tablet. She'd spent hours crafting this talk, weaving together principles of quantum physics with lessons about human interaction and understanding. Her Guggenheim medallion caught the light, but it wasn't her most prominent accessory today. That honor belonged to her grandmother's watch, a reminder of perseverance through challenges. Distinguished colleagues, Judge Barrett began, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised even his longtime associates. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to share something personal. He removed his glasses, looking directly at the audience. 20 years on the bench taught me to be efficient, but last week taught me that efficiency without awareness isn't justice. The room fell silent. In the second row, Mrs. Chen, the court clerk, smiled encouragingly. She'd helped organize this event, recognizing its potential impact on the legal community. Dr. Maya Richardson, the judge continued, came into my courtroom over a parking ticket. She left having taught me, having taught all of us, an invaluable lesson about looking beyond our immediate assumptions. He paused, letting his words settle. Her response to that morning wasn't anger or resentment, but rather an willingness to engage in dialogue for positive change. In the audience, the young girl from the courtroom, now part of Dr. Richardson's new weekend science program, clutched her physics textbook proudly. Her mother, a regular court translator, wiped away a tear. Dr. Richardson approached the podium as applause filled the hall. The same confident stride that had carried her into court now brought her to face a very different audience. "Thank you, Judge Barrett," she began, her voice clear and measured. In quantum physics, we study how particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until they're observed. In many ways, human potential works similarly. What we observe often depends on what we're willing to see. She clicked to her first slide, a split image of the courthouse and her laboratory. These two buildings, separated by just a few city blocks, represent different approaches to understanding our world. But today, we're building bridges between them. Judge Barrett, now seated, noticed several of his colleagues taking notes. The president of the Bar Association was already whispering about expanding this into a regular series. Dr. Richardson continued, seamlessly connecting scientific principles to everyday human interactions. She explained how Heisenberg's uncertainty principle could apply to human judgment, drawing knowing laughs from the legal professionals in the room. The future of our community, she concluded, depends not on maintaining separate spheres of knowledge, but on bringing them together. Every interaction, even a parking ticket, carries the potential for positive change. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her speech. It was for a moment of transformation that had sparked a movement. As Judge Barrett joined her at the podium for the cue and a session, their respectful interaction demonstrated everything they'd been discussing. Outside the hall, the city hummed with its usual energy, but inside, something special was happening. Lawyers asked questions about quantum physics, scientists explored legal concepts, and everyone present felt part of something larger than themselves, a community growing wiser together. Spring bloomed across the city as Dr. Richardson's quantum physics lab transformed into an unexpected hub of community activity. Every Saturday morning, the normally pristine research facility filled with excited voices as high school students gathered for the new Science Meets Justice mentorship program. Today was special. Judge Barrett had arrived early, watching with quiet amazement as Dr. Richardson guided a group of teenagers through an experiment about probability. She cleverly designed it to demonstrate both scientific principles and decision-making in legal contexts. "You see," she explained, adjusting a complex apparatus, "just as these particles behave differently under observation, human behavior can change depending on perspective. A young girl in a wheelchair, one of the program's most enthusiastic participants, nodded intently while taking detailed notes. Across campus, the changes were visible. The parking lot that had sparked it all now displayed clear, redesigned signage. The first project completed under the city's new Community Access Initiative. A plaque nearby read, "Where Understanding Begins," with both Dr. Richardson's and Judge Barrett's names listed as founding advisors. In his chambers, Judge Barrett had made his own changes. Scientific journals now sat alongside legal texts, and his walls featured artwork from local schools, showing children's interpretations of justice and discovery. His morning docket looked different too. He'd implemented a context-first approach, ensuring every case received the thorough attention it deserved. The courthouse lobby had become home to rotating exhibits about science and law. Today's display showcased student projects from Dr. Richardson's mentorship program, including a fascinating study on how scientific evidence had changed legal outcomes throughout history. Mrs. Chen, the court clerk who had witnessed the original incident, now coordinated a weekly lunch where legal professionals and scientists shared insights. "It's amazing," she told a colleague, "how many breakthrough ideas have come from these conversations." Local businesses had caught the spirit. The coffee shop between the courthouse and university now offered the Quantum Justice Special, with proceeds supporting scholarships for underprivileged students interested in science or law. Their bulletin board displayed success stories, students who'd found their calling through the new mentorship program. Dr. Richardson's inbox pinged with an email from the mayor's office. Other cities had noticed their program's success and wanted to implement similar initiatives. She smiled, remembering how a simple parking ticket had catalyzed such change. In the university hallway, she passed a group of law students heading to their new Science for Lawyers elective, a course she co-taught with Judge Barrett. Their latest assignment involved analyzing how scientific methodology could improve legal decision-making. The judge himself had undergone the most remarkable transformation. Today, as he watched another student demonstration, his usual stern expression had softened into genuine curiosity. "Dr. Richardson," he called out, "could this principle of uncertainty you're describing help us design better rehabilitation programs?" She turned from the experiment, her eyes lighting up at the question. The students gathered closer, witnessing yet another moment where two worlds merged to create something new. Outside, cherry blossoms drifted past the laboratory windows, their pink petals a reminder of how beauty could emerge from unexpected places. A news crew set up their equipment in the courtyard, preparing to document this innovative program for a national broadcast about community transformation. "The real experiment," Dr. Richardson told the gathering, "isn't in these machines. It's in how we choose to see and understand each other." Judge Barrett nodded, understanding now that true justice, like true science, required both wisdom and wonder. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in courtroom 4B. The city convention center buzzed with excitement as hundreds of people gathered for the first annual Science and Law Fair. Banners celebrating "Where Discovery Meets Justice" hung from the rafters, and interactive exhibits filled the sprawling space. Dr. Richardson stood at the center of the main hall, her grandmother's watch marking another momentous occasion. She watched as Judge Barrett engaged with a group of young presenters at their booth titled "Evidence Beyond Doubt: How Science Strengthens Justice." The students, once strangers to both law and advanced science, now confidently explained complex concepts to visitors. Dr. Richardson called out a familiar voice. The young girl from the original courtroom scene, now a high school junior, rushed over with her science fair project. "An innovative study on bias in artificial intelligence. I've been accepted into the summer research program at MIT." She beamed, clutching her acceptance letter. The former parking ticket that started it all hung in an elegant frame near the entrance, surrounded by photographs documenting the year's journey. Beside it, a digital counter showed impressive numbers. 500 students mentored, 50 community projects launched, and 15 cities adopting similar programs. Judge Barrett approached, accompanied by the state's Chief Justice. "Maya," He said, using her first name as colleagues now did. "Would you join us? The governor wants to discuss expanding the program statewide." He smiled at a group of elementary school students racing past with model DNA structures. Who would have thought a parking ticket could lead to all this? The convention center's main stage featured a rotating schedule of speakers, scientists explaining legal concepts, lawyers discussing scientific methodology, and students presenting research on everything from forensic science to environmental law. Mrs. Chen, now the program's administrative director, expertly coordinated the complex event schedule. In a quiet corner, Dr. Richardson found a moment to peek at her phone. A notification showed that her latest research paper, combining principles of quantum mechanics with decision theory in legal systems, had been accepted for publication. The paper was co-authored with a judge from another state who had been inspired by their program. "Your Honor," a young law student approached Judge Barrett, "my team's project was inspired by Dr. Richardson's work on uncertainty principles in witness testimony. Could you both review our findings?" The two mentors exchanged knowing glances before following the student. Their relationship had evolved from that tense courtroom encounter into a partnership that was changing lives. They had discovered that their fields weren't so different after all. Both sought truth, both required careful observation, and both had the power to transform society. As evening approached, the fair's closing ceremony began. Dr. Richardson and Judge Barrett took the stage together, standing before a diverse crowd of scientists, legal professionals, students, and community members. The original parking space outside the Science Center, now designated as the Understanding Spot, was visible through the convention center's windows. "1 year ago," Dr. Richardson began, her voice carrying across the hushed audience, "a misunderstanding could have ended with nothing but frustration. Instead, it became a catalyst for change." Judge Barrett nodded, adding, "We learned that justice, like science, requires us to look beyond our first observations, to seek deeper understanding." Together, they presented awards to students whose projects best embodied the spirit of their program. As applause filled the hall, Dr. Richardson caught sight of a family entering the parking lot outside, a parent scanning the newly clear signage with appreciation. The sun set over the city skyline, casting a warm glow through the windows. In that light, you couldn't tell where the courthouse ended and the university began. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all.